it's been a great pleasure for me to have participated these days in the EMFI conference. And I know there's a lot of limitation in the fact that we're doing it online, and a major limitation for speakers like me is that if we are at the conference, we would have attended the sessions which were going on, and learned a lot more than what we contribute. And I remember that when the last time when I attended the EMFI conference, it was such a learning experience in the fact that I could attend some of the sessions, and I hope you all had a great experience attending the different sessions and being blessed by it. And it's a great uh, activity of bringing people together and actually being able to reflect on the details of our call to be health professionals. Now, I am grateful that I could look at the Old Testament context. And as I said on the first day, that God very specifically reveals himself. All that we know about God in the biblical understanding is based on God's revelation to us, because human reflection doesn't help us to actually connect to God. And unfortunately, what has happened is people over the years and centuries have reflected on God and have written. But the Christian faith very strongly believes that the knowledge of God, apart from what is revealed to us in creation, is largely through the revelation of God. And the Bible says God has spoken to us in the past, and then he spoke to us through his Son. And John says when Jesus came, he revealed the Father to us. So very clear, right, from that revelation of God, that we know the God of the Bible that we worship is a God who strongly is a God of character. And unfortunately, these days, when we talk about our God and we say, who is like unto our God, we tend to think of him more in terms of the power that he has. Who is like unto God? He can do this and he can do that. But in the biblical understanding, who is like unto our God is largely related to the fact that God is a God of character. God reveals himself as the one who is the father of the fatherless, the one who is the forgiving God. And I think it is very important as we talk about God to understand that the revelation of God that we know from the scripture is that of a God who is concerned. And that is why we are in mission. We are in mission because we have been called and sent out by a God who is concerned. So we don't create our own activities. We fulfill his expectation. So with that in mind, we saw in the last two evenings about this theme of developing and how God put in place systems and structures, and told Israel in the appointment of leaders, they should appoint leaders who are very specifically committed to ensuring that as a nation, people will hear the concerns of God through the priests and through the kings and judges. They would, as a nation, do that which is good, and especially for the poor, the rights of the poor. And then, of course, he raised prophets who reminded the people as to what were the concerns of God, what were the violations. Now, the prophets are a very important part of the tradition that we have in the Bible. And when God speaks, it says he spoke to us through his prophets. And even Moses is known as a prophet of God. And Samuel too is known as a prophet. So the role of prophets don't always have to be those who are prophetic in terms of what God is going to do, but who articulate the concerns of God. Now, this evening, for our last session, I want to look specifically at this prophetic tradition, because prophetic tradition unpacks for us the concerns of God in terms of real issues. It's one thing to know God is concerned about the poor, but how does the working out of it, look like? How does it look like in real life? And unfortunately, what has happened is when the prophets are talking about the standards of God being violated by the people. So, in that regard, what we hear is the concern of God, when in real life, this concern of God for the poor is not actually worked out. So, that is basically what happens when we talk about the prophetic tradition. And there are many ways to look at the prophetic tradition, because there are prophets even outside the prophetic books. The prophetic books are basically the prophets who wrote, or at least something about them is written, like in the case of Jonah, and then in the case of Habakkuk, his struggle with God. But otherwise, prophets are basically speaking the voice of God to their times, the concerns of God, and they're basically unpacking the violations of the concerns of God in the real life of the nation Israel. And it's a very important part of the tradition. And we have first Jonah, excuse me, Jonah, who is the prophet, and I don't have COVID, so don't worry. The prophetic tradition, what happens is that we have Jonah who runs away from God, and the God brings him back. That's the first of the written prophets, called minor prophet among the minor prophets. Not minor because the size of the book is small, but largely he is a prophet, and he was the first of the prophets in the order, chronological order of the books of the prophets. Then we have three very significant prophets who I believe almost lived at the same time. That would be Micah, that would be Amos, and that would be Hosea. And very close after that was the prophet Isaiah. Now, Isaiah must have heard about the prophets, Micah and Amos, because there are a lot of things that Isaiah says which not necessarily borrowed from these prophets, but definitely talked about the same concerns. And so when we look at the prophetic tradition, very early, in the year, I think Amos and Micah would have been in the 7th century. That means, very early, God raised these voices to speak about the concerns of God. There were people like Elijah, Elisha before that. Of course, we know of Nathan who talked to David. So this is a very rich tradition. And unfortunately, the prophetic tradition has been usurped by people who interpret prophetic tradition as prophesying or foretelling what is going to happen in the future. And 2020, I think, saw unleashing of a lot of these people who prophesied what 2020 is going to be, and what that they saw visions. And unfortunately, I don't know whether any of those prophetic words were actually words of prophecy, as I would call them, but basically trying to put in their desires and their interpretation. And then we saw what happened in the American election, when we came across quite a few prophets who were speaking on behalf of God and claiming things which did not happen at all. Now, Bible is not talking about foretelling. Of course, there's a lot of things which are written there. But what is most important for us as we talk about the tradition of prophetic ministries is to voice the concerns of God. And so this evening, I want to look at at the prophet Amos. That's what I've selected to look at, because he captures these concerns of God, and especially speaks about it when it is violated by the nations. And so I want to look at it so that it helps us to grasp what it means to align to God with God for the poor. And the way Amos is written, the first chapter, in fact, till chapter 2 and verse 8, are a series of prophecies which Amos speaks to the nations. Now, Amos was not from any of these nations which are found in the beginning. He was actually from Judah, and he was by profession somebody who he says was more of an agriculturalist. I don't think he was a farmer. Maybe he was a laborer or somebody who was collector. He worked in fig tree, as he says. And that's when God called him. And God called him to go and prophesy. And the first series of prophecies are against nations. And I think I would like to pause here because I believe that this is a very important aspect for us to recognize what is the one of the reasons for poor, and one of the reasons why we have a lot of poor people. Of course, poverty is in every nation, but there is one large group in our country, in our world, who are poor because of the actions of nations. And in the book of Amos, he starts off by saying, "For 3 sins of Damascus, even for 4, I will not relent." And then he begins to identify, the different things that these nations have done. He talks about Damascus, he talks about Gaza, he talks about Tyre, he talks about Edom, he talks about Ammon, he talks about Moab, he talks about Judah, and then he talks about Israel itself. And very important to know that much of the poverty is not simply created by just the systems and structures, it is also created by nations. And that is why, as people who follow God, we should be very clear about these concerns. And it's a vast list that Amos is asked to talk about. He talks about Damascus, which it says she threshed Gilead with sledges having iron teeth. We in Delhi have been looking at all these things that are put on the road to keep the farmers from moving. And here is something which talks about sledging, the threshing Gilead, brutal way of dealing with nations. That's what Damascus did. There was no compassion. Later on, it talks about Edom. He pursued his brother with sword and slaughtered the women of the land. And later on, it talks about Ammon. He ripped open pregnant women in order to extend his borders. And then it talks about Moab, burnt to ashes the bones of Edom's king. And we must be aware that many people who are poor in the world today are poor because of conflicts between communities and between nations. And these create a large number of people who we call poor. They are not poor by any particular background. They were not born into poor families, but they became poor. And the unfortunate thing is that the church, especially the communities which are engaged in society, shy away from engagement in the situation of communal violence. And when there is a flood or there is an earthquake, it is easy to mobilize health workers to come and do some work there. Not just health workers, development organization. But when it comes to conflicts between nations, which are violent, and which, in fact, he talks about Gaza, that they took captives, whole communities, and they sold them to Edom. There is the whole human trafficking. And usually what happens is people who believe in God generally like to withdraw from such situations. How I wish perhaps EMFI itself could have a team, a medical team, which is available for conflict situations.
when there is communal violence. Maybe there are, but usually we don't go there because that's very political. Very political. We will be seen as, not as taking sides. For instance, in the city of Delhi now, we have a large number of farmers who are on strike. I wish there were medical teams which would set up, places for helping these farmers with medical work. But there are groups doing, people who are mobilizing medical supplies for them. But Christians play safe. But Amos is very clear. His first list of violation of God's character was by nations themselves out of their greed in order to broaden their territories. They sold people, they trafficked with human lives, they ripped open pregnant women, they threshed nations, they threshed the people with the sledges of iron. All these words are used. And I think in the years to come, it would be a very important challenge for us to ensure that our presence in such conflict situations to provide care would be very important. We usually withdraw from such situations. And that is where most of the poor are formed. In these days, there are thousands, not thousands, I think lakhs of people who come under the category of displaced people. Not displaced because they're looking for jobs, not displaced because of some environment, some calamities or crisis, but basically displaced because of war, conflicts, internal conflicts and external conflicts. And I think it is very important for us to take seriously that this is one of the things that causes, in the world, a lot of pain and a lot of poverty, and poor people are produced in such situations. And that's not the only thing that Amos goes on. He tells, interestingly, he starts off by talking about Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, and Ammon and Moab. And then he moves to the nation Judah and Israel. And when he moves to them, he doesn't talk about any actions which they did in terms of other nations and their violence. But he talks about situation which we would not put in the same category. Yes, to rip upon open pregnant women and to sell people and to be involved in ruthless war definitely is bad. But God speaks through Amos and says, for three sins of Israel, just like he said about the three sins of Damascus, for three sins of Moab, he says, for three sins of Israel, even for four, I will not relent. What are the three sins? They sell the innocent for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground and deny justice to the oppressed. What is God saying? God is saying, for me, to sell the poor for a pair of sandals, to trample upon their head, and to deny justice for the oppressed is the same as threshing Gilead with sledges of iron, ripping open pregnant women. He doesn't say, your sin is in category 4. No, he doesn't say that. He said, for three sins of Israel. And then he lists, and then he goes on to say, father and son use the same girl and so profane my holy name. They lie down beside every altar on garments taken on pledge. It was a requirement in the Old Testament that when somebody takes money from you, you should not take as pledge their garment or their cloak and keep it overnight, because they will need it to cover themselves. And very important, God says these are things that for God is equal, because the poverty is not kind of a secondary sin in the Bible. It is equal to violence, equal to ruthless violence that we carry out. And that is when we look at the poor, we should see them as victims of a violent society. That is what it is. It is greed causing people
to fall into the margins. And so Amos would say that this is the concern that God is upset about. Now, let me move on, because when we're looking at aligning ourselves, what is God concerned about when he talks about the poor? In the book of Amos, then he says there is a second important thing that upsets the concerns of God for the poor is the lifestyle that we have. Amos is very strong when he talks about it. He says, for instance, when he talks about the lifestyle of the people, he says in chapter 3, I will tear down the winter house along with the summer house. The houses adorned with ivory wall will be destroyed and the mansions will be demolished. God was not against beautiful houses, but he was against the fact that these houses were built by plundering people. He said earlier in verse 10, they do not know how to do right, who store up in their fortresses what they have plundered and looted. God is very clear that he is against the lifestyle built on exploitation. And then he goes on to say in chapter 4, hear this word, you cows of Bashan on Mount Samaria. That's how he addresses some of these rich women. He says, you women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, and say to your husbands, bring us some drinks. They were not directly responsible for exploiting the poor. They were not directly crushing the needy. But the fact is that they had a lifestyle, and in order to sustain that lifestyle, they had to be involved in situations which oppress the poor. We have to watch, as those who are Christians, as those who are believers in the God of the Bible, that our lifestyle does not cause the poverty that is in the world. We need to be careful what we buy and how we consume. And one of the problems that we have in the evangelical community is the fact we have a theology on what we should do. We have a theology of, what kind of jobs we should do. Noble profession like health is considered something that is very good. And then there is a theology which covers how we tithe money. But I think it's high time we also have a theology of consumption, because we don't have to consume all that we generate. We think once we give 1/10 to God, that is enough. I think it's a very hard world in which lifestyle can cause. Of course, our lifestyles can cause health issues for us. That's not what I'm talking about. But our lifestyle can cause poverty in this world. We have to be very careful as to how we live. And then the third important thing that Amos brings up is the oppression that is there in the system. How do poor people become poor? God is concerned. When we align with God for the poor, we need to know that poverty is interlinked. And so Amos would say in chapter 3 and verse 11, he says here that, not in chapter 3, verse 11, he says here later in verse 11 of chapter 5, you levy a straw tax on the poor, and you impose a tax on their grain. Systems in which the poor were exploited by the taxation system, even on their straw, which perhaps they used for covering in their huts or for their cattle, there was a tax. And you impose a tax on their grain, their hard work. That's what the farmers are saying. And all over, what the poor do, we say, okay, the poor don't pay income tax. Definitely they may not come under the income tax bracket, but in the products they buy, they have already paid a lot of tax. And I think what God was saying here is that there are systems of oppression that causes poverty. You oppress the innocent and you take bribes. That's what it says here in verse 12. I know how many are your offenses and how great are your sins. There are those who oppress the innocent and take bribes. and they deprive the poor of justice in the courts. They influence the courts to ensure that the poor are not given justice. And that is what we need to keep our eyes open. To be a voice for the concerns of God is to be aligned with God. We need to ensure that this country does not have laws that make the poor poorer, because these are days in which the poor have no access to facilities because it's all being bought and it's being run by people who can pay money, and it's run for people who can make money. And it's a very sad situation, and the health sector is no different. And it's very important for the health sector to be a voice against the exploitation of the poor. And then it says, you deprive the poor and you take justice to, and you deny them justice in the courts. And very important for us to remember this, that poor are poor because of the breakdown of the systems and structures. So to align with God would be many times to be a voice for God in the concerns of the poor, because the poor don't know. They don't even understand how they are being exploited, why they don't have access to benefits which others have, because we have put a price on it, a price which makes it hard for the poor to come anywhere near it. And God is concerned. And then another important area where God is concerned is not just the fact that it is lifestyle which is causing poverty, the systems of oppression, nations creating poor people, but the total indifference in the body of Christ. It talks about it later on. It says in chapter 6, woe to you who are complacent in Zion, to you who feel secure on Mount Samaria, you notable men of the foremost nation, to whom the people of Israel come. And what happens? You put off the day of disaster and bring near a reign of terror. You lie on beds adorned with ivory and lounge on your couches. You dine on choice lambs and fatted calves. You strum away on your harps like David and improvise on musical instruments. You drink wine by the bowlful. You do not grieve over the ruin of Joseph. God says there is another whole world which allows poverty to continue to grow and destroy lives of people, because there are a whole lot of people who are complacent. They're doing their work well, but they said, beyond this, we are not interested. We're not interested in what happens in other parts of our nation. We're not interested. And God is saying, you are basically enjoying, you're complacent people, and you strum away. He's not against music, but he says you strum away and do not grieve over the ruin of Joseph. And worse still, in chapter 5, it says in verse 21, God says, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offering and grain offering, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offering, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harp. What has happened is, many places we have replaced a lot of things in the place of concern for the poor. And one of the things is the whole area of worship. God is not against worship. God seeks true worshipers. That's what Jesus said. But worship that is totally indifferent to the concerns and the pain that is on God's heart is not acceptable to God. He says, I hate your gathering. Away with the noise of your songs. He says, I will not listen to the music of your harps. Let justice flow like a river and righteousness like a never failing stream. This is all God, to align with God's, with the heart of God on behalf of the poor, is to feel the pain in the heart of God. And God is pained to see a church a community of faith which is totally indifferent to what is happening around. Yes, they do their work, but beyond that, they say, "Oh, that's not my area of expertise." But be concerned. You may not be able to change everything in the world, but you definitely can intercede for everything in the world. Your prayer life is a good indicator of how much you feel the pain in the heart of God. And because this is all created, and so God would say, to the prophet Amos, I hate all these things. And Amos raises the breakdown. And along with Amos, there was another prophet, Micah. And Micah also spoke about the same concerns of God. They were not in the same place, but the similar concerns. All nations, doesn't matter where you are from. You could be in Israel, you could be in Judah, you can be in some other nation, Sodom and Gomorrah. Doesn't matter where you are. God wants us to be committed to the concerns of God. Micah actually says what happens. In the book of Micah, very often you'll find these strong words that Micah brings, which creates poverty. He talks about people who actually, he says, they covet the fields and seize them and houses and takes them. There are a whole lot of wicked people who plan how the land of the poor can be taken. And many times, our health institutions are located in areas where tribal land is being taken away. And remember, you are the ones who first know what is happening around. And the prophet Micah would say, these people, they sleep, they go to bed, they plot evil on their beds, and they covet the fields and seize the houses of the poor. They defraud the people of their home and they rob them of their inheritance. Very soon, the poor are people who are produced by homelessness. Their homes are taken away. The streets are not safe. And God says, I'm concerned about it. Poverty is not something that is produced somewhere. It happens all around us. Every day, a new group of people are becoming poor. A new group of people. For every new rich person, there are millions of poor people who are produced. And I think very important for us as an organization that is involved, as we mobilize people to ensure that we are aligned to the concerns of God for the poor. The prophet Micah would say that this concern includes the fact of how market is run. He says in chapter 6, God says through the prophet Micah in Micah chapter 6, am I still to forget all your ill-gotten treasures? You wicked house. God is very upset with money that is taken not on straight ways, clean ways. The short ephah, which is accursed in your measuring tools, the way you do pricing for product. God says, I know what you're doing. I know what you're doing. You provide a service and charge them more than what you should charge them. He said, shall I acquit someone with dishonest scales, with a black bag of false weight? He says, I watch. God says, I'm watching how pricing is done, which creates poverty. The poor become people who cannot afford. And God says, I know this. Will I acquit you? Will I say you're innocent? No wonder God says, I don't want it. Prophet Isaiah would say, I hate your gathering. He says, this is not the kind of fasting that I want. The fasting that I want is for you to loosen the bonds of the poor, to feed those poor. That's what God would say. And here he says, your rich people are violent, your inhabitants are liars, and their tongues speak deceitfully. A whole nation creates a culture of poverty, a whole society. And I feel sometimes that this is something that is spreading all over in such a way that even tribal communities, which earlier were seen as an equal community, is now being from values from outside are coming in and creating division. I've seen it in many parts of India, where tribal communities, where all of them work together, live together, took care of each other, are now divided by values which are so alien to them. And God says, these are things that I'm upset about. So, my prayer for EMFI is that you would align yourself to the concerns in the heart of God for the poor, the heart of God which is broken, to see how nations destroy communities, destroy and sell people, how not only nations destroyed, systems which destroy, lifestyles of indifference, the rich becoming richer at the expense of the poor. And my prayer is that God will raise a new group of people, not just in the health sector, but just all over, who will be quick to voice the concerns of God, to do what we can do. And my prayer is that EMFI kind of groups can give us the lead. Thank you very much. I want to thank Dr. Sam Siddharth for the opportunity for me to be present here and to be able to share God's concern. And my prayer is that you would work towards making this happen, so that this nation of ours, India, can never say we did not know what is the concerns of God in for our nation, because there was a group called EMFI. Thank you very much. Thank you, Shruti, for the opportunity.